Buenas tardes, good evening. Welcome to Duke Divinity School. My name is Peter Casarella from the faculty of the Divinity School, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. I want to, before introducing our distinguished guests this evening, I want to thank our Dean, Dean Edgardo Colon Ivereigh, and the Dean's Office for sponsoring this event. So it's a distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce to you a great friend and a very trusted colleague, Dr. Austen Ivereigh. Austen Ivereigh is, and I want to also, before I begin with that, is thank the people online who are joining us. Dr. Ivereigh is a fellow in contemporary church history at Campion Hall in Oxford. And I'll be very brief in my introduction because there's many things that are important to say here, but I'm going to focus on four visages of Dr. Ivereigh, if you will, that I've come to know and from which I've learned so much. So the first is Dr. Austen Ivereigh, the scholar. His Oxford dissertation from 1995 dealt with Catholicism and politics in Argentina from 1810 to 1960 and really paved the way, in many ways providentially, for what we're about to hear this evening. But he's had many other scholarly engagements, some more recent, an essay on La Patria Grande, the idea of unifying Latin America that animates Pope Francis, that he contributed to a book I co-edited, as well as a more recent article that I think gets to his current interest, We Belong to a People, that looks at the roots of Pope Francis' theology and the theology of the people of God, that came out in a recent publication of Massimo Fagioli on Pope Francis, A Voice Crying Out to the World. The second vintage that is really important too is Austen Ivereigh, the journalist. And it was actually right after the election of Pope Francis that he went down to Buenos Aires and spoke as a journalist, as an accomplished journalist, to the friends of Francis, to the enemies of Francis, the people who knew Francis firsthand. And it was out of that, he was basing that on his experience working with the tablet, being the press spokesperson to Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, the Archbishop of Westminster, and doing very important work in the media around 2010, the time of Pope Benedict's visit to the United Kingdom, with a project called Catholic Voices, bringing together a very timely issue of people in the Catholic Church who didn't necessarily agree. So he's very accomplished in that realm as well, and that paved the way for his entry into the stratosphere, the pantheon of academics who write best-selling works, up there with Joseph Ratzinger and Kate Bowler and other such famed people. And his first book, published in 2014, translated into at least 12 languages, is The Great Reformer, the biography of Pope Francis, but then based upon his journalistic and academic experience. That was followed by another very excellent work on the reform efforts under the pontificate of Pope Francis, a very wonderful book named Wounded Shepherd, and that was followed in 2020 by something that's very unique, a book that was written by Pope Francis, but with Austen Ivereigh as the acknowledged voice. Now, it's really more than a ghostwriter. It was really almost a co-written book. And it's a beautiful little book that I really highly recommend to you if you haven't read anything on Pope Francis or by Dr. Ivereigh. It was written during COVID about the spiritual crisis of COVID, but the chapter in there on the concept of the people is really a word to English-speaking people about what this Latin American concept of pueblo is all about. And last but not least, and this you won't find on the Wikipedia page, Dr. Austen Ivereigh, where's Dr. Wiersba, is in the agrarian spirit a farmer. And as he's here in Durham, North Carolina, he's speaking by cell phone to his wife back at their 15-acre farm in the UK, where there's a new baby ewe who's appeared and has to be fed with a bottle. So he juggles all of these talents, scholar, journalist, and best-selling author and farmer all at once. Tonight, Dr. Ivereigh is going to speak to us about Francis at 10, a pontificate of conversion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Austen Ivereigh.
Peter, thank you so much for that very generous and very sophisticated introduction to my life. Thank you so much. I really do feel like I'm among friends here, and I know that's a convention to say, but I really do feel it. Over the years, people I've admired have all ended up coming to the Divinity School in Duke. And I've always wanted to come here and see what this is like. So it's really great to be here. And just really warm thanks to the Dean, to Edgardo, for the hospitality and the generosity of this stay here. And full marks to Casey, who's going to hear this lecture or a version of it for the second time, because we were together just the other day in Davenport, Iowa, where it was snowing and icy. So I arrived here and in the sun, and I wrote on Twitter, "Et in Arcadia ego," that's how it felt. So great to be here. So this is a kind of a 10th anniversary. Francis turned 10, as it were, just the other day. The 19th of March 2013 was his inaugural Mass as Pope. So there has been a lot, you may have seen quite a lot of coverage about this 10th anniversary. So this is really the lecture I'm giving to mark that. So it's the theme that I want to explore. It really has one big idea. I'm calling this actually the turn to the spirit and to the people, because it's trying to get at the heart of what I think is the Great Reform. My first book was called The Great Reformer, so this is kind of what is that Great Reform now, looking back. And in my biography, in that book called The Great Reformer, I described what it was like in Rome at that election, being with the journalists who were covering the election. There were huge numbers of journalists who had flown in from all over the world, and most of them kind of knew very little about the church, except what they had read, which was mostly extremely unfavourable. And they were very struck. So just forgive me for quoting from the book, but it goes like this. Some of the reporters I wrote, especially the atheists or agnostics among them, who had arrived in Rome shaking their heads at Vatican corruption and hypocrisy, now confessed their amazement at what had taken place over the past fortnight. How a ship run aground was ploughing through the waves again, lifted by a fresh, strong wind that seemed to come out of nowhere. So I don't know how well the prose has held up, but I think that what those reporters sensed in Rome has been vindicated these last 10 years. With that election, a new wind, a fresh, strong wind from the south, did blow in, opening, in many ways, a new era for the church. And it's really that shift, that transfer, that I suppose I've spent much of the last 10 years seeking to understand and to explain. I think just to read the assessments around the anniversary, and to admire, by the way Francis himself gave 6-hour-long TV interviews to mark this anniversary, having already done Reuters and AP and everything earlier in the year, in itself a remarkable kind of blasting through the usual filters, is to realize that something that a Spanish cardinal, Aquilino Bocos, said on Monday of last week, and I'm going to quote him, "The church is changing," he said. "You have only to open your eyes to see that the church in its evangelizing mission has widened its horizons, is opening to new relationships and becoming present in new spaces to defend justice and peace and to proclaim fraternity." Now, the reason that I was among all the sort of acres and acres of coverage, I cite Cardinal Bocos, is, I'm sure you won't have heard of him, he's an 84-year-old Claretian missionary. I quote him because he has dedicated his life to the topic of evangelization. And he's seeking to capture a transformation that he sees that I want to focus on with you this afternoon. The Pope has spoken often of his conviction that the Lord is calling the church at this time to evangelize. And everybody ignores it because it's like, well, what else would you expect a Pope to say? Of course the church is called to evangelize. Yawn, move on. But what people are missing is what I hope to demonstrate to you this afternoon, which is that Francis is starting from a diagnosis of the church as not evangelizing, as failing to evangelize. And in reality, that is his diagnosis back then. That, put simply, it's either being shaped by modernity, at least in the Western world and in the rich North. The church is either being shaped by modernity or barking at it, either in battle with it or in retreat from it. What it's not doing is shaping and transforming that modernity. So Francis's great reform, I want to argue with you today, has been to reverse that, to enable the church essentially to do what the Lord asked it to do, which is to evangelize. And that's what he means by evangelization, to transform, to convert. Curiously, among the hundreds of questions he's been asked over the last couple of months, nobody has actually asked him, Pope Francis, how's that gone? How's it gone after 10 years? What do you think? Do you think you've succeeded? Nobody has asked him that one question. And I am sure that it is the criterion he himself would set in wanting to assess the last decade of his pontificate. So that's my argument today. So in February, March, 10 years ago, Francis did not expect to be elected Pope. I should say Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, did not expect to be elected Pope. He had a small suitcase with him and expected to be back in Buenos Aires by Easter. But among the goods he did not declare at Fiumicino Airport was a deeply discerned response to a new era in humanity. That discernment was the fruit of a lifetime, but more proximately, the result of a great meeting of Latin American bishops, of which Peter and I have often spoken, in May 2007 in the shrine of Aparecida, Brazil, which was the most important synodal event anywhere in the Christian church in modern times. And is in many ways the fons et origo of the pontificate. So Aparecida is the name of the place. It's also the name of the document which emerged from that synodal gathering, the first, by the way, in 25 years. And Aparecida is the name of the document which was mainly authored by Cardinal Bergoglio. And Aparecida makes two key moves. The first was that it saw that the church needed a conversion in order to be able to evangelize. The church needed first to convert, to change, because its structure and its internal culture still assumed a world in which faith is no longer transmitted primarily through culture, law, institutions, family, and so on. And it saw clearly that, therefore, that the mission in today's world has to start not with morals, but with the kerygma, not with the law, but with the gospel, just as in the early centuries of the church. And that this would require a going out to the peripheries, both to proclaim and also to discover the action of God and the Spirit already at work in the peripheries, as it were, outside the church, in a spirit of humility and dialogue and listening. And that this would be primarily a task of ordinary, faithful people. So those, I think, were the two key moves that Aparecida makes. The key moves. The second important move that Aparecida makes, and I think that this was Cardinal Bergoglio's contribution in particular, was to understand that the main obstacle to the conversion that the church required was the church itself. That's to say, its own spiritual desolation. The fact that the church had institutionally, culturally, mentally closed in on itself, and at the same time that the institution had become uprooted or separated from the people of God. So this was Bergoglio's key contribution, because he, more than anybody else at that assembly, and one might say more than anybody else perhaps in the whole church, has a very deep and fine understanding of what we might call the temptations in times of desolation, or in times of tribulation. In other words, the temptation of desolation in times of crisis. And he has consistently demonstrated this very, very deep understanding in a number of places. And if you like in the Q&A, we can come back to it. But I would recommend two texts in particular, one from 2019 called The Letters of Tribulation, which was really about the sex abuse crisis. So he used this understanding in the sex abuse crisis of 2018. And the other book, the other source, which is the one that Peter mentioned, the book that I wrote with him called Let Us Dream, which is his response to the COVID crisis, and he again applies this same deep understanding of the temptations in times of tribulation. But anyway, that's getting a little bit into the weeds, but we can come back to that. But what I want to, where I want to really begin is with two addresses which Bergoglio, before he was elected Pope, gave. Each of these addresses are 6 years apart, prior to his election as Pope. The first is a homily he gave at Aparecida, at that meeting I was talking about, which is almost completely unknown, although it has been published, but nobody ever talks about it. It's a remarkable homily he gave on May the 16th, 2007. And the second address I want to refer to is very well known, which is the address he gave to the cardinals assembled to elect the new pope. They hadn't yet gone into the Sistine Chapel to do what's called the conclave, when they actually elect the pope. They were in what are known as the general congregations, which are the gatherings of cardinals which always precede a conclave, when the cardinals basically ask themselves a big question, which is, who is the Holy Spirit calling forth at this time from among us, because they know it's going to be one of them. And so they have lots of discussions and speeches about the needs of the church and the needs of the world at this time, and therefore what kind of pope is needed for this time. Okay. So on both of those occasions, he said something very similar. And on both occasions, what he said had a huge impact. So I've spoken to people at Aparecida who say that after he gave this homily, the bishops stood up to applaud, which is quite unusual if you've ever been to a Catholic Mass with bishops. They don't generally applaud. And it was the only time that ever happened in that meeting. And more than one has said to me that they were convinced he was ungido, that he was anointed. There was this sense that in what he said, they saw the signs that he had been anointed. And then in 2013, exactly the same thing happens with the whole lot of cardinals who had no idea really about him. He wasn't particularly well known among the wider College of Cardinals. He gave this speech, and many of them were convinced that the Holy Spirit had made its choice. So, what is it that he said on both occasions that had the effect? Sorry, I'm a writer, I like to build expectation. But let's begin with the second one, because it's better known. So in 2013, Bergoglio gives a speech for no more than 3 minutes, which was one among the shortest speeches given by anybody on that occasion. He did not list any specific problems or challenges facing the church, because the cardinals had spoken of almost nothing else for the previous 2 weeks. And he spoke right at the end of the meeting. What he offered instead was a spiritual diagnosis of those problems, which was summed up in what he describes as the church's failure to evangelize, without using quite that expression. What he said was this: evangelization is the church's raison d'être, reason for being, the reason for which it exists. And he presented then an image which became famous of Jesus in the book of Revelation, not outside the door knocking to be let in, but rather trapped inside the sacristy asking to be let out. And he said, he contrasted this evangelizing church. Sorry, he presented, and then he described how the church leads the church out from itself, to go out from itself, salir de sí misma in Spanish, to the peripheries of pain and longing to bring God's mercy, proclaiming the word. And he contrasted that vision of an evangelizing church with a church that failed to do this, and he used the image of, the famous image of the paralyzed or bent over woman in Luke's gospel, who can, only look down at the ground. Okay. So he said, and this is now a quote from him, to simplify, there are 2 images of the church: the evangelizing church that goes out from itself, or the worldly church that lives in itself, of itself, for itself. This should illuminate, he said, the possible changes and reforms to be realized for the salvation of souls. And then, in case there was any doubt that he was talking about the church, as it was at the moment, he said that the task of the next pope was to help the church to, again, go out from itself to the peripheries to be, as he called it, a fruitful mother who lives from the sweet joy of evangelizing. Now, I want to focus on these words, to go out from itself, or in Spanish, salir de sí, or salir de sí misma. This is often described as Francis wanting a missionary church, a church that goes out, la iglesia en salida, la chiesa en uscita. But this is to miss the deeper point that Francis is making, and it's captured in his language. He doesn't talk about a church that goes out, que sale, but a church that goes out from itself, que sale de sí misma. He's referring, in other words, not to a move outwards, I start here, I go out, but rather something much deeper, a capacity for self-transcendence, in contrast to self-immanence. And the theologians among you know exactly what I'm talking about. So in St. Augustine's classic formula, it's the contrast between love of self, closed to transcendence, amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei in Latin, versus the love that gives of itself and thereby finds God, amor Dei usque ad contemptum sui. So St. Augustine, in that famous formulation, which is very familiar to Bergoglio, was talking about what is sometimes referred to as the capax Dei, the capability of knowing God and of receiving that the God makes of God's self. It's the basis of all love. It's the basis of all service. It's the basis of all relationship, religiously. And it's a matter not just for the individual believer, but also for the body of believers, the church itself. So that evangelization, at its most basic or essential, is a response to the gift that God makes of God's self to us, which leads us out from ourselves, specifically the action of the Holy Spirit, leads us out from ourselves, outwards in relationship to God, but also to our fellow creatures and to creation itself. So a failure to evangelize is both cause and consequence of a church which is incapable of doing it because it has closed in on itself. And just to illustrate this point, because it's not well understood, I'm going to take just a few examples in Francis's teaching documents of this expression, Salut Laissez, so you understand exactly how he's using it and what it means. In Evangelii Gaudium, by the way, I did a word search for this on that expression, Salut Laissez. But what I found when I then looked at the English translations, and I'm afraid this is sadly true so often with Vatican translations, is that it was badly translated as simply going out. So what you're going to get from me is my translations of Salut Laissez, in other words, correct translations of Salut Laissez. Ignore the official Vatican translation, in other words. Evangelii Gaudium, which was the document of 2013, the programmatic document, The Joy of the Gospel, number 87, to go out from ourselves and to join others is healthy for us. To be self-enclosed is to taste the bitter poison of self-immanence. Self-immanence is the contrast, of course, with self-transcendence. Laudato Si, the famous encyclical, social encyclical on care for creation. We are always capable, number 208, we are always capable of going out of ourselves towards the other. The basic attitude of self-transcendence, breaking with the isolated conscience and self-referentiality, is what makes possible all care for others and for the environment. Gaudete et exsultate, Rejoice and Be Glad, his document on holiness of 2018, number 131. Look at Jesus, says Francis, whose compassion, quote, moved him to go out from himself to announce, to send on mission, to send his disciples to heal and to liberate. And then Fratelli Tutti, the second social encyclical on fraternity, which came out in October 2020, number 88. Since we were made for love, in each one of us, quote, a law of ecstasis seems to operate, to go out from ourselves to find a fuller existence in another. Okay, I could multiply the examples, but I wanted just to illustrate that this is not just simply a phrase that appears in that speech, it runs throughout the teaching. And it's, I think, very well developed in Fratelli Tutti. The whole argument of the document on fraternity is precisely about this, the temptation of self-immanence versus the capacity for self-transcendence. And he classically uses the famous Good Samaritan parable to show that it's the priest and the Levite who are incapable of self-transcendence. They are locked in their own self-immanence, their own functions, their own roles. They fear, faced with the wounded man on the other side of the road, they retreat into themselves, literally, they run on, they move on, whereas the despised foreigner is capable of self-transcendence and therefore of creating a new future. Now, the image that Cardinal Bergoglio uses to describe a church trapped in self-immanence that recalls also St. Augustine's other phrase, curvatus in se, being turned in on oneself, which is St. Augustine's description of sin. So it's the self-deception that rejects dependence on God. It's to depend on us, on the ego, on ideology, on instrumental reasoning, and interestingly, in one of the interviews that Francis has just done for this 10th anniversary, he was asked about hell. You know, journalists love to ask popes these questions. So what's hell? And he says it's a state of people who make for themselves a world of self-referentiality. That's Francis's description of hell. Now, in the case of the church, in that speech back in 2013, Bergoglio's talked about a phrase used by the theologian Henri de Lubac, which is spiritual worldliness. So a church that is self-immanent, or close to self-transcendence, is a church that lives for itself. And this, of course, is the source, he says in the speech, of the narcissism which afflicts the church, or indeed any religious institution. So, clericalism, corruption, all kinds of narcissism, which of course were, and corruption of various sorts, which were part, of course, of the cardinals' discussions in that pre-conclave meeting. So spiritual worldliness means that the church, rather than living from the light of Christ, lives or attempts to live from its own light. So it's like it looks at itself in the mirror, hence the narcissism. So that's the 2013 speech. Now we'll go to the homily which he gave in May 2007 during the General Conference of the Latin American Bishops. So Bergoglio's homily, it's a beautiful homily, he's meditating there on the agency of the Spirit. So he's talking about how it is the Spirit, basically, that does everything. It's the Spirit that leads the church out into God's mystery, that leads the church out to evangelize, that builds the church, that creates communion, and so on. And he says, a very clear expression, it's the Spirit that leads us out to evangelize and in the process frees us from being a self-referential, self-sufficient Gnostic church. Okay? Then he likens that to, as he would later, to the bent-over woman in Luke's Gospel. But he adds something really important in this homily, which is not there in 2013. He talks about the woman bent over, con el pueblo de Dios por allá, with the people of God somewhere off over there. This is really key. The church in the Western world is shrinking, not because the people have left the church so much as because the church has left the people, has withdrawn from the people. Con el pueblo de Dios por allá. This goes directly against the diagnosis at the time, which was very common, about secularization. Secularization means, culture is abandoning the church is shrinking because people are leaving the church. So in a deeper sense, he's identifying, I mean, of course it's true that people have left the church or do leave the church. That's obviously indisputable, but he's highlighting the deeper problem, which is the church, as it were, shrinking into itself. That the institution has become identified, as before Vatican II in many ways, with the clergy, the hierarchy, with the juridical institution. That's become, if you like, a corporate church, a worldly church. And this is the diagnosis that he will return to often in 2018 in response to the various revelations of clerical sex abuse. There was a whole wave of them in 2018, a new wave of revelations. And of course, Francis is particularly alive to this because his own tradition in Argentina, we were just talking earlier about the theologian Rafael Tejo, who draws attention to the fact that Catholic faith in Latin America is above all lived by the people and from the people. I mean, that's the tradition in Latin America of what they call popular religiosity, is a reflection of the fact that the evangelization of Latin America was never clerical. It couldn't be. There were just too few missionaries and vast populations. So this is a big theme for that tradition that Francis belongs to, that it's the people, the ordinary people, who transmit the faith. The people, as it were, evangelizes itself, to use an expression he would use in Evangelii Gaudium. So this is a very different ecclesial culture from the corporate church that confuses evangelization with proselytism. And very often, Francis, in returning to this topic of evangelization, almost always says evangelization is not proselytism. So what is proselytism? Well, proselytism is to be concerned above all with institutional survival. It's to invest resources in expensive or elaborate programs designed to persuade people to come back to church, but is unconcerned with transmitting the gospel in such a way that it transforms the world in which we live. In Evangelii Gaudium, The Joy of the Gospel, in 2013, Francis very sharply notes that all these programs of renewal, he says, have failed, quote, to bring parishes closer to people, to make them places of communion and participation, nor to make them wholly mission-oriented. This is quite a strong thing for the Pope to say about the basic unit of the Catholic Church, that parishes are remote from people, that people don't participate in them, and the parishes themselves have little impact on the world around them. It's a very strong indictment, even though expressed, of course, in classically papal language. Now, let's step back. Here's where it gets kind of interesting. Why, if you weren't interested up to now, why, according to Bergoglio, had the church, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, fallen into self-referential desolation? What was going on? What was the diagnosis? Well, the answer is to be found, actually, oddly at the moment, Francis himself is doing a series of catecheses on evangelization. And, again, not coincidentally, the papal preacher is giving the Lent meditations on the very topic. So, again, suggests that this is important for Francis. What Father Raniero Cantalamessa said just the other day in his first meditation, when he's talking about how the church in the late 19th and early 20th centuries withdrew more and more into itself, a cycle from which, of course, Vatican II seeks to rescue the church. Cantalamessa puts it like this. The real problem does not lie in novelty. It doesn't lie, in other words, in change. Right? The problem, rather, is how we deal with it. It is how we respond to change. And let me just try and put this very simply. Do we, as church, take seriously Christ's promise that the Spirit will guide the church through change, through history? Or do we retreat into what Francis in Evangelii Gaudium calls sterile pessimism, which he defines as the fruit of an anxious and self-centered lack of trust? In a letter, after he goes back from Aparecida, he writes this letter to catechists in Buenos Aires, in which he observes that the greatest threat to the church lies not outside but within, from what he called the eternal and subtle temptation of beleaguered self-enclosure in order to feel more protected and secure. Or again, in his letter to the German church in 2019, he warns them of giving away to the anxiety that closes us in on ourselves. So the problem, in other words, is not change, but an anxious response to change that fails to trust in grace. Is that point okay? Is that fairly clear? Because, so what I'm really saying is that Bergoglio, and particularly Bergoglio with his synodal and pastoral experience behind him of the Latin American church, sees in the church's response to modernity essentially a crisis of faith, of the sort that Peter experiences, sorry, not this Peter, Peter the Apostle experiences when Jesus invites him off the boat and says, "Follow me." And Peter, of course, takes his eyes off, ceases to trust Jesus, looks at the waves and the winds and sinks. It's that kind of a crisis of faith. A very different kind of crisis of faith from the one that church leaders and, if you like, a certain kind of conservative would talk about, which is a crisis of orthodoxy, a crisis of obedience, a crisis, if you like, of adherence to orthodoxy. And indeed, even the whole discussion around orthodoxy, the obsessive concern with the law, with liturgical rubrics, with, if you like, a kind of grim moralism, an obsession with certain bioethical questions, not naming any particular bishops' conferences here, all one might say would be signs of a desolation rooted in a lack of faith, of a self-centeredness bereft of, cloaked in outward religiosity, bereft of God, as Francis memorably describes it. So if you like, an us and them mentality, a sense of victimhood, dreaming of the leeks and onions of Egypt, while forgetting that the promised land lies ahead, as he put it to the bishops in Chile. So this is not just the diagnosis of Bergoglio alone, but the Latin American church in general at Aparecida. And what I think is so significant about Aparecida, and that's why to understand the pontificate we have to understand Aparecida, is that Aparecida gives, if you like, the only, that I know of, non-anxious, discerning response to modernity that we've seen in the 20th century in the church. And I don't mean by this that Aparecida is in any way accepting of modernity. Aparecida has a very strong, well, you can see it in Laudato Si with the technocratic, it's a very, very, very grim, in a way, view of modernity. But rather than recoil in horror, what Aparecida does is perform the act of self-transcendence that discernment requires. In other words, they asked, what is the Spirit asking of us in this time? How do we need to rethink our mission in order to proclaim the kingdom in the new circumstances of our age? In other words, how do we evangelize this world, and how are we called to change in order to enable that evangelization? Now, in Wounded Shepherd, my second book, I describe this as an option to discern and reform rather than lament and condemn. Okay, that's just the way I put it, sort of simplistically. It's a decision to, faced with tribulation, to discern and reform rather than lament and condemn. And you'll notice, of course, that the first response is an act of self-transcendence. Because in discerning, you're asking the key question, what is the Spirit asking of us? It's opening ourselves out to the action of the Spirit. Whereas the lament condemn option is, we've got the answers, we've got the truth, we need to hunker down, go back, condemn, and so on. So it seems to me that this is really key, that a parousia does the thing that Francis has been inviting the church to do this last 10 years. And it grasps that evangelization cannot be any more corporate. We no longer live in Christendom, and that the church must start again in its evangelization, start again from Christ, from what a parousia will call the foundational encounter with Christ, an encuentro fundante, from which will flow transformed people, transformed lives, a transformed way of being, which are deeply attractive. So that both these elements, the rejection of the temptation of self-immanence and the decision to be renewed from the encounter with Christ, run throughout a parousia. If you pick up that document, you see that key idea running through it. But it's encapsulated very beautifully in one paragraph in the parousia document, number 11, which has 4 sentences which I think perform this key move, and I think it's helpful to just go through that. So 4 sentences, each of which, so first of all, there's the response to a call. Quote, the church is called to a deep and profound rethinking of its mission and to relaunch it with fidelity and boldness in the new circumstances of Latin America and the world. So we begin with a call, a response to a call. Secondly, we reject immanence, or the temptation of self-immanence. Quote, it cannot withdraw in response to those who see only confusion, dangers and threats, or those who seek to cloak the variety and complexity of situations with a mantle of worn-out ideological slogans. That's rejecting the lament and condemn option. It's rejecting, if you like, the culture war option. Right? Thirdly, to decide in favour of self-transcendence explicitly. So what a parousia says is, what is required is confirming, renewing and revitalising the newness of the gospel out of a personal and community encounter with Jesus Christ that raises up disciples and missionaries. So the decision there is to go out and be renewed by the encounter. And then lastly, be guided by the Spirit. And this is key because this is about agency. So what the paragraph 11 ends by saying is, this depends not on grand programs and structures, but rather on new men and women who incarnate that tradition and that newness, it's both, as disciples of Jesus Christ and missionaries of his kingdom, protagonists of a new life for Latin America that awaits to be rediscovered with the light and power of the Spirit. Okay, so I've only read those because it seems to me this one paragraph contains these key moves. Okay? And I think you can see those same moves being performed throughout the pontificate, throughout those teaching documents. A discerning, trusting response to change, trusting not in modernity, obviously, but trusting in Christ, trusting in the Spirit. Asking, what is the Lord asking of us, right? An explicit rejection of the spirit of defeatism and pessimism, which are fruit of desolation, which causes us to close in on ourselves. And an explicit commitment to self-transcendence, which is to start again from the encounter with Christ. And not for nothing, therefore, does Evangelii Gaudium, which is the first great document of the pontificate, which is all about evangelization. And it begins in paragraph 3 by saying, I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ. And by the way, the first time that that phrase has ever appeared in a papal teaching document, the encounter with Jesus Christ. So I'm reminded of something that Jean-Luc Marion says in his book, Brief Apology for a Catholic Moment, that the church, if we believe what the church teaches, appears in many ways as the only entity which is not in crisis, ultimately, because it can always decide to begin again from Christ. That's the promise of Christ. So that's why I think these 2 speeches of Bergoglio's lay out that decision to start again from Christ. And the pontificate essentially can be seen as the story of what happens when a pope makes that option. What it means to act against the ills that flow from narcissism and pessimism, so that means combating clericalism and spiritual individualism, the courtly culture of the Vatican, the resort to authoritarianism, etc., etc. And what it means to commit to an opening up to, it's a simultaneously opening up to the Spirit and also an opening up to the people. And that, in this pontificate, means to embark specifically on the path of synodality, which is a listening to the Spirit in the assembly of the people. So the 2007 homily doesn't actually include the word synodality, but synodality is what he describes in that homily when he speaks of what happens when the church goes out of itself to evangelize. Quote, people and pastors make up this holy, faithful people of God, all together with the Pope, people and pastors, dialoguing as the Spirit inspires us, praying together and building the church together, or rather as instruments of the Spirit which builds the church, unquote. So you can see a clear link there from 2007 to Francis on the night of his election, 13th of March 2013, when he asks the people to bless him. He famously bows his head and he asks the people a blessing. And when he lifts his head, he says, now let us begin this journey, bishop and people together. And then we can go through to October 2015 when he gives his great speech about his vision of an entire, what he calls a holy synodal church, when he describes a church of, quote, mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn, the faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, in order to know what he says to the churches. So I know that the language is, classically papal and theological and so on, but there's a big idea being expressed here. And we can go then from there to what has at the moment very much dominating the life of the Catholic Church at this time, which is the so-called Synod on Synodality, which began in October 2021 and will conclude in October 2024. And it begins literally with every diocese of the world inviting the people to assemble, to listen to each other, and then the church then listens in various different ways to the fruits of that listening. Notice that the three things that Francis said in Evangelii Gaudium were lacking in parishes, that quote I read you earlier, right? What were the three words? Communion, participation, and mission. And those are the three words of the Synod on Synodality. So the participation of the people, the communion of the faithful, and the mission of the church to go out from itself, all these depend on a shift, a conversion, a move from self-immanence to self-transcendence. So the key concern then is how we open the church to the action of the Spirit that is already at work in the life of the people. And that's a much deeper reform than mere structural change. And that's why I want to argue, and I'm not alone in arguing it, that Francis's most significant move these past 10 years, his lasting legacy, will be the Synod on Synodality, which is the largest exercise in self-transcendence in human history, arguably. Given that you think how big the Catholic Church is, think all these dioceses came together, we're talking about many, many hundreds of thousands of people. Nothing ever like it has been carried out. So, in my remaining time, I'm going to illustrate this shift that I see Francis leading, just with a few examples, because in a way, you can almost everything about the pontificate these last 10 years can be read in the light of this, and obviously a lot's happened in the last 10 years. And it would be tedious to try and go through it all, but I just want to highlight a few things which I think illustrate that this hermeneutic key kind of works to understand what's been going on. That almost everything can be understood as a bid by Francis to equip the church for evangelizing the contemporary world by urging self-transcendence and combating the temptation of self-immanence. Of course, it's a conversion, and like all conversions, it encounters resistance. It takes place over time, and indeed it takes time. And I think actually Francis part of his kind of genius as a spiritual leader is that he takes into account, as a great spiritual director, the very resistances and temptations that of the change he's seeking to bring about. So here are I'll give you 5 examples, and I'll probably go through them quite quickly. First one, just in general, confronting self-enclosure or self-immanence. Well, you can see his concern, particularly in the first part of the pontificate, with the ancient heresies of Gnosticism and Pelagianism, which he sees constantly behind. Self-immanence is usually revealing that there's Gnosticism and Pelagianism. And that these are both temptations because they offer false reforms. In other words, they offer themselves as responses to the crisis of the church in the Western world, while in fact only perpetuating that crisis because they dig the church deeper into the very thing that's the cause of the problem. So their temptations in Ignatian terms, sub angelo lucis, they appear in the guise of an angel. They look, in other words, very religious, very holy, very Catholic, but in fact they conceal a worldly faith in human agency. And they squeeze out grace even while they might appeal to it in words. And Francis deals with this temptation very directly in a series of addresses, Florence 2015, Evangelii Gaudium, Gaudete Exsultate. He actually confronts these very specifically and explicitly. So on the right, he's confronting, I say on the right, I don't know whether these right-left terms work, but if you like, the conservative or right-wing temptation would be the Orthodox or faithful Catholics or the traditionalist groups which have sought to use the old liturgy to combat effectively Vatican II, to insist on more and more rigour and so on. On the other hand, on the left, you might call it, there's a sort of liberal progressive agendas prevalent in the church, particularly in the rich north, which will tend to see the traditions of the church through the lens of equality and democracy, and which have particular concerns about gender and sexuality, which are legitimate, but sometimes the lens with which they view them are purely, if you like, worldly. So these are signs, both of those would be signs for him of self-immanence that keep us locked into narrow frameworks. Francis has noted often that the precepts that Jesus gives the church are really very few, and that the church shouldn't add to them in such a way that religion becomes a burden. And his other constant theme is that the actions that best show forth the love of God are essentially the works of mercy. They're works that reveal the love and mercy of God. And that liturgy is to enable self-transcendence. So what is a good liturgy? A good liturgy is one that opens our hearts to each other. In other words, we don't go into a liturgy for God's sake, but if you like, for our sake. So this has been a constant concern. He pointed out just the other day in one of these worships that social commitment is a consequence of worship. The two go together. They can't be separated. We recognize Christ in the other. So that the transformation that liturgy helps us with, or indeed prayer, is ultimately a shift of self-transcendence. So, generally, this is number two, opening to others in general and opening to the poor in particular. I mentioned already Fratelli Tutti, the Good Samaritan, the way he uses the Good Samaritan parable to illustrate how the religious remain trapped in their social roles, in contrast to the pagan, who's the only one of the three capable of going out from himself. Francis notes in Fratelli Tutti, and I hope you get the sting here, quote, "A believer may be untrue to everything his faith demands of him, and yet think he is close to God and better than others," unquote. And yet Jesus, he said, makes clear that there is only one test of our authentic guarantee of fidelity to God, quote, "a way of practicing the faith that helps open our hearts to our brothers and sisters." That's the only authentic criterion of faith, according to Jesus, according to Francis. So the test of evangelization is essentially that. Evangelization is not persuading people to come to church. As Benedict said, the church grows by attraction, not by persuasion. Francis puts it like this in one of his catecheses: we need to put Jesus in contact with the people without us convincing them, but allowing the Lord to do the convincing. So it's the transformed way we live that evangelizes. In Paraguay in 2015, he puts it like this. He said, "We often see evangelization as strategies and tactics, maneuvers, techniques, as if we could convert people on the basis of our own arguments." But he said that's not what the Lord does. The Lord sends his followers out poor, dependent on others, dependent on the hospitality of others, not full of themselves. And he says, today the Lord says to us quite clearly, you do not convince people with arguments and so on. You convince them by learning how to welcome them. So hospitality is the mark of true evangelization, because a welcome is an act of self-transcendence. Thirdly, openness to grace. Well, going out from self-transcendence, means a church that necessarily has a different understanding of power from the world. It implies a rejection of what in Latin we might call potestas, in favour of another Latin word, ministerium. It's not so much the power over, but the power to serve. And this was precisely, by the way, the topic of his homily at that inauguration mass in 2013. All authentic power, he said in that homily, which is on St. Joseph, is service. And in very direct and practical ways, he sought to convert the way that power and governance are exercised in the church to reflect this. And I've been writing a lot about this, and gave a lecture in California recently about this, about the whole kind of conversion of power. But just to briefly mention, the fruits of that transformation are to be seen, above all, in the Vatican. We were just last night having dinner with, this is being live streamed here. There was a dinner with the bishop last night, in which he was talking about how you go to Rome now, the Vatican, and they look you in the eye, they smile, they say, how can we help you? In contrast to how it used to be, which is when they were treated like altar boys, or treated like, people coming to the headquarters to be reprimanded or given their orders. It may not sound like a big shift, but it's a huge shift in the internal culture of the Vatican. The appointment of lay people, and indeed women, to significant positions in the Vatican. It's the opening that matters. So yes, the priesthood remains celibate and all male. But in opening that priesthood, that clerical caste, if you like, to partnership and collaboration with lay people, women and so on, then we have the self-transcendence. All this is part, of course, of the healing of clericalism, of the abuse of power, which flows from a separation from the people of God. Francis is very trenchant on this. The clericalism is the idea that the people serve the church rather than the church serve the people. And of course, at its most grotesque, that is what has been revealed in the sex abuse crisis. And the response to that crisis, as we all know, has been sometimes very hard to distinguish from a major petrochemical corporation concealing the results of scientific surveys showing the effect on climate change. In other words, the church has so often acted like a self-interested corporation, which is part of the way why young people can be so put off the institution. Francis's key move on this has been to open the church to the voice of the victims, the experience of the victims. Spectacularly in 2019, when he got all the heads of all the bishops' conferences of all the world to a summit in Rome and made them listen to hours and hours of harrowing, really harrowing testimony from abuse victims. And they, particularly those who came from developing countries who said, oh, this is an Anglo-Saxon problem, they came away shattered and determined to extirpate it in their own countries. So this is important here because there's confidence here in the agency, again, of Christ, of the Spirit. It's not all about new laws. It's not all about new regulations, although that's obviously been important. It's about a conversion which begins by sitting in shame and humiliation and failure and opening up, therefore, to the grace of conversion. And that's why synodality has turned out to be so important, because if clericalism is the proximate cause of the abuse crisis, clericalism cannot be solved without an active participation of God's people in the life and mission of the church. That's why synodality is key. So this is often misunderstood, because when people talk about Francis' reform, they think about new bodies or structures or who's been sacked, who's been replaced. It's the corporate model. But actually, if you only go down that route, then you lock the church into the self-immanence that gets it into the problem in the first place. And this, by the way, is his criticism. We can get into this in the Q&A. This is his criticism of the German synodal process, which is very different from the wide global synod on synodality. Because that's a reform program designed by the German church in response to the sex abuse crisis, according to a predetermined agenda, being carried out essentially by an elite group, nominated and so on, but an elite assembly, which Francis himself has described as elitist. And that's one of his words to indicate self-immanence. It's locked, in other words, into itself. Fourthly, a focus on the Beatitudes and Matthew 25. This is really very straightforward. In response to the temptation of self-immanence, of Gnosticism and Pelagianism, he talks about two royal roads. The heart of the gospel, he also refers to them. The Beatitudes and then the words of the Last Judgment in Matthew 25, both obviously about self-transcendence. Can we respond to the stranger in front of us, or do we retreat back into ourselves? So An evangelizing church capable of self-transcendence is necessary to heal a world in which there is a crisis of belonging, which stems from a self-enclosure. And it requires, of course, understanding that reality, or believing that reality is essentially good. It's the joyful mystery to be praised, as Laudato Si puts it. So it's this confidence, this trust in grace, that ultimately that reality is benign because God is there and never abandons us, which is the source of his joy and the source of the joy of the gospel which he urges on the church. So if the crisis of our age is a crisis of belonging, or rather non-belonging, Laudato Si 66 describes a crisis of three intertwined relationships: with God our Creator, with creation, including our fellow non-human creatures, and thirdly with our fellow human creatures. So the sin in this case is to seek to possess rather than to value as gift. It's a sign that we've closed in on ourselves. So it's to that triple rupture that Francis responds with those three great teaching documents. Evangelii Gaudium and Gaudete is all about healing our relationship with God, or enabling the relationship with God. Laudato Si with creation and our fellow non-human creatures. Fratelli Tutti with our fellow human creatures. Each takes the sin of self-enclosure, our self-enclosure from God, from creation, and from each other, and invites us to salir de si, to accept our vulnerability, our dependence on all three, to care for each other and for the natural world, as our Father cares for us in that logic of gift, or rather than possession or domination. And Norman writes, of course, so beautifully about it. So the hope of this world, the hope of this pontificate, is that humanity can open itself to that ultimate reality. It's all about opening up to reality. That's at the heart of self-transcendence. Fifthly, lastly, the focus on the peripheries, or the other. So the whole, what I might call the fraternity agenda of the latter part of the pontificate is driven by this understanding or recognition that modernity is lopsided. If modernity is defined by the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, we've had a whole lot of liberty, we had a whole lot of equality, or drive at least for those two. What we're lacking is fraternity. And without the drive to fraternity, without the commitment to fraternity, as he says in Let Us Dream, the other two end up lopsided. Liberty becomes a liberty at the expense of others. Equality can become flat and a uniform thing. So fraternity is born, as he says in Fratelli Tutti, it calls for something greater than liberty and equality. And that is why he constantly urges us to accept and embrace difference. Because difference, a reconciled diversity, fraternity is not uniformity. It is to allow a unity which accepts difference. And that's why he's constantly urging us to undergo the existential self-displacement, which is what creates fraternity. And this is what lies, of course, at the heart of his foreign trips, always to places, the peripheries. It's why he, as I've argued recently in Commonweal in a cover article, why he's gone to Lampedusa and Malta and here to Ciudad Juarez, Dhaka, to show us the faces of the migrants. Because only when we look and we see the faces of the other, those others, that we can begin to have a discussion about migration, which is real. Only when we, as it were, listen to that cry of the person on the rubber boat in the Mediterranean, the person crawling across the desert in Arizona or Texas who's saying, "Don't let us die." Only when we hear that voice and we see that person can we open our thinking up to some of the solutions around migration. Or to put this differently, or put it the opposite way around, a discussion about migration that doesn't start with those faces and those voices, that screams them out. In other words, the discourse of national populism and so on, is a discourse conditioned by self-immanence. It's a discourse conditioned by our own fears and anxieties, and is therefore a shrinking from reality. So the task, our conversion for Francis, depends on the capacity of humanity to move from I to we. Construirnos en un nosotros que habita la casa común, as he says in Fratelli Tutti, to build ourselves into a we, which inhabits our common home, so that we can recover the dignity of ourselves as a people, but also recognize the dignity of creation and cease to live in self-enclosed referential structures in which the neighbour loses all meaning, as he puts it in Fratelli Tutti. So a culture of encounter, one of the great phrases of this pontificate, is all about a deliberate choice to enable that dialogue, that encounter, which allows for or creates self-transcendence. And there are so many different examples of this, it would almost be to tell the story of the whole pontificate, but just two examples: the construction of an alliance with the Muslim world, famously in 2019, or his great bid to bring together Catholics and evangelicals, which I'll be speaking about tomorrow afternoon. So let me just conclude by going back to that speech to the cardinals in 2013. The task of the next pope is to help the church to go out from itself, to be a fruitful mother that lives from the sweet joy of evangelizing. Well, clearly he's helped to do that over the last 10 years. I think Cardinal Bokos was right. You only have to open your eyes to see that the church has widened its horizons, is opening to new relationships, becoming present in new spaces. Certainly in my own life, I look at myself, and I think of my own transformation this last 10 years in following Francis. I think of just a few weeks ago, I was in Waco, Texas, with a whole lot of Baptists who have been converted by Laudato Si. I mean, these are signs that I think of things happening, of the church entering into a self-transcendence. But it's a major question as to whether in parishes and in dioceses we really have abandoned corporatism and clericalism and self-referentiality, and whether we really are capable of opening ourselves to this call to evangelize which Francis has made to us. And that, I think, is where the debate will begin, or can begin, or can happen, is around the implementation or reception of that. And I think, but I want to suggest to you today that at least I've given you a key that will help us to understand what he has been trying to do, and then we can discuss whether he's done it or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Austen, for this brilliant lecture. I mean, just taking that one point you made about salir de sí mismo as a transversal that helps us connect Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, is just extremely valuable. We'll open up now to questions. You can take your own questions, and then Dr. Freeman, Curtis Freeman first.
Austin, thank you so much. I'm looking over the camera here. Thank you so much for being here and your generosity. You've been coming to my class and others, and we really appreciate all that you've done for us so far.
I've done various Zoom. We've done various things over Zoom in the last couple of years, haven't we? So great to see you.
So it's great to have you here. And you know, I'm a great fan as a Protestant of Pope Francis. I love his leadership. I pray for him every day. I try to remember to do that. And in Fratelli Tutti, the greatest challenge, and I think one of the most courageous steps that I've seen any pope take, is to say the church and Christians must never turn to capital punishment and war as solutions to resolve conflict. We must renounce these as instruments of, he doesn't say instruments of the devil, but this is what he means. The greatest crisis to this right now, and I have friends, very close friends in Ukraine. We've lost over 400 churches as Baptists in Ukraine. I've known pastors, I've known deans of seminaries that have been murdered by the Russian military. They feel betrayed by Francis, not because he's not concerned, but because the Russian church is engaged in a holy war against Ukraine, and they don't feel that he has exercised, or that anyone has exercised the leadership that he calls for in Fratelli Tutti, including Protestants and people like myself. And maybe as we just are lost in this. I feel perplexed. I don't know what to do, but can you give us any insight into this? This is just deeply, deeply disturbing to me.
This is a difficult question to speak about simply, because from the very moment that Putin's invasion began, Francis began to talk about Ukraine and has spoken about it virtually every day, virtually every Angelus, every address. And he's always drawn attention to the suffering that that is a result of war. And he's focused mainly, of course, on Ukraine as the victim of aggression. But he's also focused on the grieving mothers of Russian soldiers, who after all are conscripted and so on. And what he's trying to do constantly is to talk about a different logic, which is the logic not of war. So he's trying to do two things. He's trying to say, obviously, that Ukraine has the right to self-defense. Of course, that's taken for granted, and he has said that explicitly. But he's also trying to say that war will solve nothing. But as he puts it very well, that peace that is built on rubble is not a peace. It's not a true peace. So I think what he's doing is he's avoiding the trap, which I think was laid for him very early on, of being chaplain to NATO. He's refused to be chaplain to NATO. And he's criticized Putin to his face for being chaplain to Putin. So he's arguing, in other words, that the role of religions in this war must be to stand for another logic for resolving conflict. And then personally, he has done a lot to position the Vatican so that it can be the place where, when there's an exhaustion sets in, and who knows what's going to happen now, I mean, this war just goes on and on. But if there comes a moment of exhaustion where both sides, or Putin particularly, say, we need a way out, we need a space where then they know that they can go to the Vatican. And that while Francis has been incredibly critical of Russia, he's avoided using the rhetoric, for example, which the local Catholic Church and the local Orthodox Church in Ukraine, I mean, the rhetoric there is absolutely blood-curdling. He's avoided that. And that's a strategy to stay slightly above. Does that begin to answer the question?
Yes, but you're saying we must wait and be patient.
No, he's well, we have to be patient, because until there is a desire for peace, there is no peace. So the church has a lot of experience in mediating wars and so on, and it knows that when wars escalate, polarization feeds on itself. Wars escalate, and that's what's happening now, by the way. Arms are now pouring into Ukraine, the whole thing's escalating. That's the way it's going to go. But there will come a point where both sides might be, or one side willing to break out of that. And that's when the church steps in. Until then, there's not a lot it can do except pray and remind people constantly of the suffering involved, because this is the key thing. In war, we forget who suffers, and he keeps saying it's the poor, it's the elderly, it's the children,
Okay, I can, you want me to, maybe I'll focus. I saw Luke Bretherton, and well, let's start with Luke, please. Luke.
Obviously, it's a joy to have you here. So it's a question, invitation to reflection of a kind of discernment of two lines of conflict which seem to be at work kind of underneath what you were laying out. On the one hand, there's kind of seems to be a long-standing debate between the Latin American bishops and the kind of analysis in the European context of the crisis of faith in the European context of secularization. You can think of Benedict's kind of Regensburg address, how to resist the kind of decline of faith in response to forces of secularization, whereas in the Latin American context, as I understand it, the threat to faith is the kind of threat of dehumanization, primarily through kind of market forces and authoritarian state structures. And these are two very kind of different analyses, and Pope Francis is siding with the Latin American context over against the European primary analysis of the problem. But then within Latin America, there's the kind of, my friends, the conflict between the Argentinian line of liberation theology of the people, as against the emphasis on it's just about structures of to kind of change the structures, to kind of change consciousness, and then they have to attend to the life of the people in the Argentinian context, the piety of the people, and spirituality is at the heart of that. And I just, his invitation to reflection are these kind of some of the fissures which he's navigating as a kind of background context, and can you kind of expand on that?
Thanks. Well, I mean, that's a characteristically brilliant kind of summary of all these. I think, and it's very good, the analysis, but I think it only takes you so far, because I don't think he fundamentally sees that the challenge of modernity that faces the Latin American church is any different from the one that faces the whole world. It's the challenge of globalized modernity and so on. So there's a lot in the Parasita about fragmentation, what we would call the liquid society and so But I think the difference between his, or what one might call the Aparecida perspective, and the European, and I think very often North American response to secularization was the one I was trying to capture. And you can see this very clearly, and I describe it in The Great Reformer. Before France's election, so 2012, Benedict hosted a synod on the new evangelization. And the Latin Americans got really annoyed because actually it was all about Europe. The assumption was that Europe had to be recovered for the faith. And then there was all this discussion about programs and apologetics and so on. And the Latin Americans were just looking at this and saying, but they're not seeing what the real problem is, which is this institutional desolation. So the Latin Americans arrived at that synod with all talking about pastoral missionary conversion. And they themselves, of course, were quite kind of joyful and outgoing, while the Europeans were all, I mean, even Cardinal Dolan came away depressed from that synod because he was always just so pessimistic. So I think Bergoglia's analysis goes really much deeper than any of this. It goes to and it is a spiritual diagnosis, and I really want to emphasize this. It's the diagnosis of a master Ignatian spiritual director who's familiar with the movements of the spirits, and he's looking at Europe and saying, and generally I've spoken to many Latin American bishops, and they say their view of Europe is that they lit the flame of Vatican II, which was all about an evangelizing church, and then they grew frightened and stood back and let it all, while the flame took off in Latin America. So actually what's happening now in this pontificate is that Latin America is bringing the flame of Vatican II back to Europe, if you like.
Unfortunately, I have to leave.
Cecilia first, and then we'll...
It's not
No,
a question,
please.
but actually just show my gratitude
Cecilia,
for everything
very
that
good
you
to
have
meet you.
said, especially the words in Spanish. So I will have the opportunity to have a longer conversation tomorrow.
Con mucho
I
gusto.
have 3 kids who might be expecting dinner by now.
That's okay.
Muchas gracias.
No, a usted.
Muchas gracias.
Nada, gracias, Cecilia. Mary, Mapenta Fulkerson, please.
Thank you so much. This is just really rich. And I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister, obviously female. So what I want to ask you is the ways, I mean, there's so many of the values or goals or goods that you named could be used to authorize ordination of women. So that's the question that I'm asking you about. But things like being able to be a critic of orthodoxy, you said. It was possible to be a critic of hierarchy in the Catholic Church. That there is a call to evangelize, and that church needs a conversion. So a conversion could be on any of these kinds of topics. But a healing of clericalism. A kind of unity that accepts difference of all sorts.
Yeah.
An opening up to the Holy Spirit, and opening up to others in the sense of hospitality. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
And you think that this suggests ordination of women? Is that what you're?
Well, they could be used
sure, of course.
as rationales.
Yes, and they are being,
Huh?
and they are being. I mean,
Okay.
the movement to ordain women in the Catholic Church,
Yes, has happened.
which isn't actually very big, but I mean it's very kind of strong, and it's focused in mostly here and in Europe to some extent. Would be saying precisely that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Well, I mean, I can.
Is that going to happen, or what?
Well, no, it isn't going to happen because there's no tradition of female clergy in the church, at least not in this pontificate. He's made that clear. I was actually sitting on the plane to Sweden to mark. He was travelling to Sweden to mark the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And on the way back, I was right at the front, and next to me was this Swedish journalist, and she asked exactly that question. And she just said, what about it? And he said, and he was standing this far from me, he said he believed that John Paul II had closed that door. And she said, what, forever? And he said, yes, that's how I read it. Now, he wasn't going to get into the arguments and stuff, but effectively he was saying that door is closed. There is no tradition of a female clergy in the Catholic Church, therefore there is no ressourcement, there is no way of recovery. Now, there's another discussion about the opening up the diaconate to women, which we were having a very discussion in Davenport, Iowa. And sorry about my
That's right, Siri. Calm down.
Right, some of you guys.
But so Casey should be speaking about this because Casey, of course, runs Concerning Deacons. But and I think there is that discussion that's going on at the church and has been going on in this pontificate, and he's very much allowed and opened that discussion by appointing a commission to look at the historicity of women deacons and so on. And we'll see where that goes. And it's definitely come up a lot in the synod. Interestingly, by the way, the synod, women's ordination doesn't come up strongly. It comes up regularly, but it doesn't come up strongly. But what does come through from the synod very strongly, and sorry, I want to explain, I was part of the group in Frascati which had to look at all the reports from the whole world, and we did this document of synthesis, so I looked at a lot of reports. What is very strong in those reports is people saying that the Spirit is pouring out gifts at this time on women which are not being recognised by the church. But that doesn't necessarily mean ordination. And I don't want to open up a whole lot of extra controversies here, but in England, I wouldn't say that opening up to the ordination of women has, for example, got rid of clericalism in the Church of England. Would you say that, Luke? I mean, no. In other words, we can see these as solutions to problems when they might not be. Do you see what I mean? Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Janet Martin-Sauskas.
Hello, Janet.
Hello.
Gosh, I'm friends.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was teaching, but I wonder if could say something about the extraordinary reception in the Congo and what's going on, perhaps not with the Pope, but with the hierarchy there and how this is working in his vision.
Congo. In the light of the recent visit. Do you know, I was in California when that happened. I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention, but I mean, I was paying more attention to South Sudan because of the ecumenical significance of the visit. Do you want to say a bit more?
Well, no, just anything about the African church then, if you want to expand it out. Because there you have, I think, bishops standing up bravely against corruption, and they're perceived, at least they're perceived as doing so by the people.
Sure.
So I was wondering when you said it's not, that the church is like the people in some parts, people
Well, I mean,
not finding that.
Africa is, of course, a whole kind of, it's a young, vigorous church, it's an expanding church. Also, in many ways, a very patriarchal, very clericalist church. It's sort of, Africa has bits of everything really in it, and it varies very much from country to country. The visits to Africa have been usually to war-torn places. So I think, the Congo, this place where there's this global battle over these bloody conflicts over mines and so on, is also the place where extractivism, is very alive. So I think, and then of course the whole environmental question. Africa and Asia have been major focal points for this pontificate because that is the place where the church is growing very, very fast. It's where it's youngest, So it has been an important focus for the pontificate.
Well, we can conclude with that. So far, we've had no questions apart from faculty questions. I want to give anyone else, students or other participants here, a chance to ask their question before we conclude.
Feel free to ask anything you like. I'm going to be shocked.
Lee, please.
So there's been a lot of interesting discussion about the place of tradition, both during the lecture and the question, right? For example, there's been a lot of controversy, especially among certain circles in America here, about the regulation of the Trinity Mass.
Yeah.
And also you refer to, on the other hand, a positive reference to what is historical and traditional, and in some ways it's all archaeological evidence, right, with regard to women's ordination. So I'm wondering if you can give a more precise account what Pope Francis envisions to be the correct place of the tradition,
Sure.
especially the medieval one that seems to inform a lot of just what is traditional Catholic theology.
Sure. Well, he on this topic always quotes St. Vincent of Lerins, 5th century, and I'm not going to get this quite right, but it's something like the church is always, tradition is always growing and developing. So it's the same tradition, but it grows and changes like a tree, so that it looks very different 20 years on, but it's the same tree. And I think that's the paradox of tradition that he's always coming back to. He also loves to quote a quote he attributes to Gustav Mahler, and I'm told it's not Gustav Mahler, but it's something like, you know, tradition is not the preservation of ashes, but the safeguarding of the fire. Yeah, so the tradition is actually about conserving the capacity for eternal newness and renewal. So that's why tradition matters. Tradition matters to him. And in many ways, I think he's a very traditional Catholic pope. I've argued from the very beginning of this pontificate that to describe him as a liberal or progressive doesn't capture his whole, the strong sense he has of tradition. But it is a tradition that's dynamic, that's developing, that's open, that's living, just as the Second Vatican Council sees it. And of course, in that he's drawing a clear distinction between that understanding of tradition and another kind of understanding of tradition, traditionalism, which is to focus in on the past as being the place, some kind of absolute standard. So, you know, hence the problem with the traditional Latin Mass is it is actually a self-immanence. It's closing in on yourself. It's saying that this liturgy, as defined by the Council of Trent, is somehow more authentic or holier or purer. And that's why he's wanted to regulate it, because it's become actually a traditionalist movement that questions the Second Vatican Council, and as we know is very much tied up with, you know, Trumpism and national populism and, you know, wacky anti-vax stuff. I mean, which by the way is also a sign of self-immanence. So I think he's drawn a lot of attention to the way that traditionalism, which is not open to the new and open to development, closes in on itself, becomes putrid and corrupt.
Very good. We've come to a close, and just by way of gratitude, I want to thank our Dean again for sponsoring this event, and say that normally, to learn the mind of a Pope, you have to listen to a nuncio or a cardinal who comes from abroad and repeats what the Pope says, but in this case, we have a very special relationship of a scholar and a journalist and a farmer who has developed this friendship, this very, yeah, exactly, that's it. So this very unique friendship with Pope Francis, and allowing us to see the spiritual core of his vision for reform. So thank you very much, Austen, for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.